Sometimes life strips away everything you thought mattered, leaving you with nothing but the person you truly are. When billionaire Fiona Carr approaches homeless Jack Mallory on a cold Manhattan morning, both are carrying wounds that money cannot heal. Jack was once a literature professor until tragedy destroyed his world. Fiona built a tech empire, but faces her greatest fear: dying without leaving behind someone to carry on her legacy. She makes him an impossible offer: marry her, help, raise an heir, and start over together. He thinks she's lost her mind. She sees something in him that her wealth cannot buy: a good heart. Can two broken people create something beautiful from the pieces of their shattered lives? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The December wind cut through the glass towers of Manhattan like a blade, carrying with it the scent of snow and exhaust fumes. Fiona Carr stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her 42nd floor office, watching the city pulse below her like a living organism. At 44, she commanded a tech empire worth $3 billion. Her company's logo illuminating buildings across 5 continents. Yet, as she pressed her palm against the cold glass, she felt nothing but the hollow echo of her own heartbeat. The oncologist's words from 6 months ago still rang in her ears with crystalline clarity. "You beat it this time, Miss Carr. But we need to discuss your timeline for major life decisions." Timeline. Such a clinical word for the ticking clock that had suddenly appeared above her head, counting down to something she couldn't purchase, negotiate, or outsource. Her reflection stared back at her sharp cheekbones, platinum blonde hair pulled into a severe chignon designer suit that cost more than most people made in a month. Everything about her appearance screamed success, control, perfection. Everything except her eyes, which held the weight of a woman who had built an empire but forgotten to build a life. The intercom buzzed. "Miss Carr, your 10 o'clock is here." Sarah Chun, her assistant of 8 years, was one of the few people who could read Fiona's moods like weather patterns. Sarah had witnessed every failed relationship, every lonely holiday, every birthday celebrated with champagne and contracts instead of cake and candles. If Sarah noticed that Fiona had been taking longer lunch breaks lately, walking the streets around their building instead of eating at her desk, she was tactful enough not to mention it. "Send them in," Fiona replied, though her mind was already elsewhere, drifting down to the sidewalk where she'd seen him again this morning. Jack Mallory sat in the same spot every day outside the Starbucks on the corner of 5th and 47th, his back against the brick wall, a cardboard sign propped against his knees. The sign reads simply, "Homeless Veteran. Anything helps. God bless." But it wasn't the sign that caught her attention. It was the book. Every morning, without fail, he read. Not newspapers or magazines scavenged from trash cans, but actual books. Literature. Yesterday, it had been Steinbeck. Today, she'd glimpsed Camus. The books were worn, pages yellowed and corners bent, but he handled them with the reverence most people reserved for sacred texts. Fiona had built her fortune on reading people, on identifying talent that others overlooked. She could spot potential in a 22-year-old programmer or a 60-year-old janitor with equal precision. And something about the way Jack Mallory held those books, the way his weathered fingers turned pages with careful deliberation, told her there was more to his story than the cardboard sign suggested. The morning after her latest round of fertility treatments had failed, the 4th attempt, each one more emotionally devastating than the last, Fiona had made a decision that her board of directors would have called either brilliant or insane. She was going to approach the homeless man with the books. She'd spent the previous evening researching him. It hadn't been difficult. Her resources were considerable. Jack Mallory, age 47, former professor of English literature at Columbia University, published author of 2 books on 19th century American poetry, widower, father, had been living on the streets for 3 years. The file had contained one newspaper clipping that made her chest tighten. Professor's family killed and drunk. Driving accident. The photo showed a younger Jack, clean-shaven and wearing a tweed jacket, standing beside a woman with kind eyes and a little girl with pigtails. The caption identified them as Dr. Jack Mallory with his wife Dr. Elena Mallory and daughter Sophie, age 7. Fiona understood loss. She'd lost her parents in a plane crash when she was 25, inheriting their struggling software company and the crushing responsibility of keeping their dream alive. But she'd channeled that grief into ambition, transforming their small business into a global corporation. Jack had channeled his into disappearance. Now, as she watched pedestrians hurry past her building's entrance, Fiona made another decision that would have given her lawyers apoplexy. She was going downstairs. The elevator ride felt endless. Fiona had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without breaking a sweat, but the thought of talking to Jack Mallory made her palms damp. She'd rehearsed various approaches during her sleepless nights: professional, casual, humanitarian, but now, stepping onto the sidewalk, every planned word evaporated. Jack was exactly where she expected him to be, absorbed in what appeared to be a collection of frost poems. Up close, she could see that his gray hair was clean, his beard neatly trimmed. His clothes were worn, but not filthy. He was thin, too thin, but his posture suggested someone who hadn't given up entirely. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steadier. Then she felt. He looked up, and she was struck by the intelligence in his dark eyes. These weren't the glazed, unfocused eyes of someone broken by addiction or mental illness. They were alert, wary, but undeniably sharp. "I'm not asking for money," he said quietly, closing the book but keeping his finger between the pages to mark his place. "I know." Fiona reached into her purse and withdrew a business card, plain white cardstock with her name and phone number in simple, black font. "I'm Fiona Carr. I'd like to buy you coffee and discuss a proposition." Jack studied the card, then looked up at the towering glass building behind her. Recognition flickered across his features. "You're serious." "I'm always serious." She gestured toward the Starbucks. "One conversation. If you're not interested, you'll never see me again." He was quiet for a long moment, weighing something she couldn't see. Finally, he tucked the book into his coat pocket and stood. He was taller than she'd expected, probably 6'2", with the kind of lean frame that suggested he'd once been broader, before circumstances whittled him down. "All right, Miss Carr," he said, his voice carrying the faint trace of an education that expensive universities couldn't quite erase. "Let's talk." As they walked the 20 feet to the coffee shop entrance, Fiona caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. For the first time in months, she looked like a woman with a plan. The oncologist had given her a timeline, but perhaps, just perhaps, she was about to change it. The Starbucks was mercifully quiet at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning, the breakfast rush long gone and the lunch crowd still hours away. Fiona chose a corner table, far from the windows and prying eyes, while Jack approached the counter with visible discomfort. She watched him study the menu board with the careful attention of someone for whom a $5 coffee represented a significant expense. "2 large coffees, black," she told the barista, handing over a 20. "And whatever pastries you have left from this morning." Jack didn't protest, but she noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. Pride, she realized, even in his circumstances. He carried himself with dignity. When they sat across from each other, the small table suddenly felt enormous. Fiona had conducted thousands of business meetings, but none quite like this. Jack wrapped his hands around his coffee cup as if drawing warmth from it, and she found herself studying his fingers, long, elegant, with calluses that spoke of recent manual labor. "You're going to think I've lost my mind," she began, then stopped. In all her years of business, She'd never started a conversation with such an admission. "Try me," Jack said, his voice carrying a hint of curiosity beneath the wariness. Fiona took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. "I need an heir. Not just any heir, someone who can carry on what I've built, who understands that wealth means nothing without purpose." She paused, watching his expression. "I've tried the conventional routes. Dating, relationships, fertility treatments. None of it worked." Jack raised an eyebrow, but remained silent, inviting her to continue. "I've been watching you," she said, then quickly clarified. "Not in a stalking way. You sit outside my building every day. I've seen you read Steinbeck, Camus, Frost books that most people today wouldn't touch. You handle them like they matter." "They do matter," Jack said quietly. "Exactly." Fiona leaned forward slightly. "I've researched you, Dr. Mallory. I know about Columbia, about your publications, about your family." She saw him flinch at the last word, but pressed on. "I know you were once a man of substance, and I believe you still are." Jack was very still, his coffee forgotten. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Carr?" "Marriage," she said, the word hanging in the air between them like a challenge. "A partnership. You help me create and raise a family, through adoption, surrogacy, whatever it takes, and in return, I give you a home, purpose, and the chance to start over." The silence stretched so long that Fiona began to wonder if he'd heard her. When Jack finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "You want to purchase a husband. I want to offer a mutually beneficial arrangement to someone who has nothing left to lose." Jack's tone wasn't angry, but there was an edge to it that made Fiona pause. Someone desperate enough to sell himself for a warm bed and 3 meals a day? Fiona felt heat rise in her cheeks. "That's not how I see it. How do you see it?" Jack asked, genuinely curious now. "Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're offering to buy a father for your future children and a companion for your deathbed." The words hit harder than Fiona expected, partly because they contained more truth than she wanted to admit. "I'm offering you a chance to matter again. To use your mind, your education, your natural compassion. Yes, I've seen it in how you interact with other homeless people to help shape a young life." Jack laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think 3 years on the streets haven't changed me? You think I'm still the man who taught Shakespeare to eager undergraduates? I think you're still the man who reads Frost on a December morning, instead of begging for drug money," Fiona replied. "I think you're still the man who keeps his corner clean and shares his food with others who have less." Jack stared at her for a long moment. "You really have been watching. I observe. It's how I've survived in business." Fiona hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Look, I'll be frank with you. I had cancer. They got it, but there are no guarantees. I have money, more than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. But what's the point if it dies with me? I want to leave something meaningful behind. Not just buildings with my name on them, but a human being who carries forward the best of what I've learned. And you think I can help with that? I think you understand loss in a way that I'm still learning. I think you know the difference between what matters and what doesn't. And I think," she paused, surprising herself with the vulnerability in her voice, "I think we're both tired of being alone." Jack picked up his coffee cup, took a sip, and set it down with deliberate care. What would this arrangement look like, practically speaking? Fiona felt a small surge of hope. He was asking practical questions, which meant he was considering it. "You'd live in my guest house initially, then we'd see how things develop. There would be a prenuptial agreement, of course, protecting both our interests. You'd have access to health care, education, if you wanted to return to teaching, and a substantial monthly allowance. In exchange, you'd help me navigate the adoption process and co-parent whatever child we're able to bring into our lives. And the marriage part? Would be whatever we make it." Fiona said carefully. I'm not looking for a romantic fairy tale. I'm looking for a partner, someone who can be a genuine father figure and help me become a better mother. Jack was quiet again, this time staring out the window at the stream of people passing by. Fiona found herself studying his profile, the trianvidi. Strong jaw beneath the beard, the slight lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter in a past life. I need to think about this, he said finally. Of course. Fiona reached into her purse and pulled out another business card, this one with her personal cell phone number written on the back. Take all the time you need. But Jack, she used his first name for the first time and noticed he didn't object. I meant what I said about giving you a chance to matter again. I've built an empire, but I've never built a family. I think we could help each other do something meaningful. Jack pocketed the card and stood. Thank you for the coffee, Miss Carr. Fiona, she corrected. He nodded. Fiona, I'll be in touch. As. She watched him walk back to his corner. Fiona realized she'd just made the most important business proposition of her life, and for the first time, the outcome was completely out of her control. 3 days passed before Jack called. Fiona had thrown herself into work with her usual intensity, but found herself glancing at her phone every few minutes, wondering if she'd overplayed her hand. When the call finally came at 7:30 on a Friday evening as she sat alone. In her penthouse apartment, she nearly dropped the phone in her haste to answer. Miss Carr? It's Jack Mallory. Fiona. She corrected automatically, then waited. I'd like to discuss your proposition further, he said, his voice formal but steady. If the offer still stands, it does. Fiona moved to her living room window, looking down at the city lights. What changed your mind? There was a pause. I realized I've been dead for 3 years. Maybe it's time to try living again. The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. Would you like to come up? We could. Talk properly. Actually, I'd prefer to meet somewhere neutral. And I'd like to see the arrangement you're proposing, the guest house you mentioned. Fiona smiled. Even in his circumstances, Jack was thinking strategically. Of course. Are you available tomorrow? Morning? I don't exactly have a packed schedule. The dry humor surprised her. Perhaps there was more of the old Jack left than either of them realized. Saturday morning arrived crisp and clear. The kind of December day that made even Manhattan feel magical. Fiona had given Jack her address in Westchester, a sprawling estate she'd purchased 5 years ago, but rarely enjoyed. She waited by the front gate, watching for the cab she'd arranged to bring him. When Jack emerged from the taxi, Fiona barely recognized him. Gone was the layered, weather-beaten clothing of the streets. Instead, he wore clean jeans, a simple blue button-down shirt, and a navy peacoat that, while clearly second-hand, fit him well. His hair was freshly cut, his beard trimmed to a neat goatee. He looked like what he was, an educated man who'd fallen on hard times, not a career vagrant. You clean up well, she said, then immediately regretted the comment. Jack's smile was wry. The shelter has a clothing donation program. I thought I should look the part if I'm going to be inspecting my potential new home. The word home sent an unexpected pang through Fiona's chest. When had she last thought of any of her properties as home rather than real estate investments? She led him through the main house first, a sprawling colonial with too many rooms and not enough life. Jack walked through the spaces quietly, his footsteps echoing in the vast foyer, his eyes taking in the museum-quality art and furniture that had never been used. It's beautiful, he said diplomatically. It's empty, Fiona corrected. I bought it thinking I'd entertain, have dinner parties, fill it with laughter. Instead, I work 16-hour days and come home to silence. The guest house sat at the back of the property, connected to the main residence by a stone pathway that wound through gardens Fiona paid others to maintain. It was smaller, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a living area with a fireplace, and a compact kitchen, but somehow felt more welcoming than the mansion. "The furniture comes with it," Fiona said, as Jack examined the built-in bookshelves that lined one wall. "Though you're welcome to add your own touches." Jack ran his fingers along the empty shelves. "I don't have any possessions to add." "You have books," Fiona pointed out. "I've seen you with different ones. Library books. I return them when I'm finished." The simple statement revealed so much about his character. Even homeless, he honored his obligations. Fiona made a mental note to stock the shelves before he moved in. They sat in the small living room, and Fiona found herself studying Jack's face in the natural light streaming through the windows. Without the harsh shadows of the street, she could see that he was actually quite handsome, the kind of weathered, intelligent face that suggested depth of character rather than mere genetics. "Tell me about the legal aspects," Jack said, pulling her from her thoughts. Fiona had prepared for this conversation, but sitting here with him made the clinical details feel suddenly uncomfortable. There would be a prenuptial agreement, of course. It would outline the terms of our arrangement, including financial support, living arrangements, and responsibilities. "And if I decide to leave?" "You'd be entitled to a substantial settlement, enough to start over wherever you choose." Fiona hesitated, "But I hope that won't be necessary. I'm hoping we can build something that works for both of us." Jack was quiet for a moment, looking around the small space. "I haven't lived indoors for 3 years," he said finally. "I'm not sure I remember how. We'll figure it out together." The words surprised Fiona with their gentleness. She'd built her career on confidence and control, but something about Jack brought out a softer side she'd forgotten she possessed. "What about your world, your business associates, your social circle? How do you plan to explain me?" Fiona had thought about this extensively. "I'll tell them the truth, that I've married a former professor who's helping me start a family. Your past is your business, and when they dig deeper, because they will, let them." Fiona's voice took on the steel that had made her a billionaire. "I didn't build my company by worrying about other people's opinions." Jack stood and walked to the window overlooking the gardens. "I want you to understand something, Fiona. I'm not the same man I was before. I've seen things, done things that have changed me. I sleep poorly. I have trust issues. I sometimes go days without speaking to anyone. I work 18-hour days. I've never maintained a relationship longer than 6 months. I have no idea how to be vulnerable with another human being," Fiona replied. "We're both damaged goods, Jack. Maybe that's why this might actually work." He turned to face her, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw something like hope in his eyes. "When would you want me to move in?" Fiona's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "Whenever you're ready." Jack looked around the guest house one more time, then back at her. "I'll need a few days to wrap up some things. Is Monday too soon?" "Monday is perfect." As they walked back toward the main house, Fiona reached into her purse and pulled out a key brass, simple, unremarkable, except for what it represented. "Your key," she said, holding it out to him. Jack stared at the small piece of metal for a long moment before taking it. His fingers brushed hers briefly, and Fiona was surprised by the warmth of his skin. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing something in me that I'd forgotten was there." As the taxi carried Jack back to the city, Fiona stood in her empty mansion and realized that for the first time in years, she was looking forward to Monday morning. Monday arrived with the kind of gentle snowfall that transformed the Westchester estate into something from a Christmas card. Fiona had spent the weekend in a state of nervous energy that was entirely foreign to her. She'd had groceries delivered to the guest house, books arranged on the shelves, classics she thought Jack might appreciate, and fresh linens placed on the bed. Then she'd second-guessed every decision, wondering if she was being presumptuous. Jack arrived at noon in the same taxi that had brought him Saturday, carrying everything he owned in a single duffel bag. The sight of it, one bag, containing a man's entire life, made Fiona's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. "Light packing," she said, attempting levity. "Easier to move that way," Jack replied, but his tone was gentle, not bitter. She walked into the guest house, maintaining what she hoped was a respectful distance. The space felt different now lived in before it was even occupied, simply because Jack was in it. He set his bag down in the living room and turned slowly, taking in the books, the flowers she'd placed on the kitchen counter, the small touches that spoke of anticipation. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "I wanted you to feel welcome." Jack picked up one of the books from the coffee table, a first edition of Frost's poetry that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. He handled it with the same reverence she'd observed on the street, opening it carefully to read the inscription she'd had added, "For Jack, may you find new roads, and the courage to take them. F. This is too much," he said quietly. "It's a gift, no strings attached." He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling that he could see straight through her carefully constructed facades. "Would you like coffee?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. "I stocked the kitchen, but I wasn't sure what you prefer. Coffee sounds perfect." They moved to the small kitchen, and Fiona found herself oddly nervous as she prepared the machine. She'd negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, but making coffee for her new housemate felt monumentally important. "Tell me about your typical day," Jack said, settling into one of the kitchen chairs. "I want to understand your routine." Fiona paused in her coffee preparation. "I'm usually up by 5:30, in the office by 7. Most days I don't leave until 9 or 10 at night. Weekends are catch-up time for whatever I couldn't finish during the week." "That doesn't sound like much of a life. It's the life I chose." Fiona set 2 mugs on the counter, then turned to face him. "What about you? How did you spend your days before?" Jack was quiet for a moment. "Survival took up most of my time. Finding food, staying warm, avoiding trouble. But I read whenever I could. It was the only way to remember who I used to be." "Who were you?" "Before, I mean. A professor who loved teaching, a husband who adored his wife, a father who thought he had all the time in the world." Jack's voice was steady, but Fiona caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "I was someone who believed that if you lived a good life, good things would happen to you." "I'm sorry," Fiona said, and meant it. "Life has a way of teaching us that fairness is a luxury." The coffee finished brewing, and Fiona poured 2 cups, adding cream to hers and leaving his black as she'd observed he preferred. They sat across from each other at the small table, and for the first time since this arrangement began, Fiona felt the weight of what they were attempting. "I should probably warn you," she said. "My social circle is going to be intensely curious about you. My assistant Sarah has already asked 3 times when she's going to meet the mysterious man who's captured Miss Carr's attention." Jack smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression she'd seen from him. "You haven't told her the truth?" "I told her I was seeing someone and that it was serious. She's been with me long enough to know that's practically unprecedented." "What will you tell people when they ask how we met?" Fiona had practiced this. "Answer that you're a professor I met through a mutual friend, and that we bonded over books and literature." Not exactly a lie. The best cover stories never are. Jack studied her over his coffee cup. "You've thought this through carefully." "I think everything through carefully. It's how I've survived." Fiona hesitated, then decided on honesty. "But I'll admit, having you here feels more complicated than I anticipated." "Complicated how?" "I'm used to controlling every aspect of my environment. Having another person in my space, even in the guest house, means sharing control. I'm not sure I remember how to do that." Jack set down his cup and leaned back in his chair. "I haven't lived with another person in 3 years. I'm not sure I remember how to be considerate of someone else's needs. So we're both flying blind. Seems that way. The acknowledgement of their mutual uncertainty somehow made Fiona feel more at ease. They finished their coffee in comfortable silence, and then Jack asked if he could explore the property. Fiona showed him the gardens, the small home office she'd had installed in the main house's library, and the pool house that hadn't been used in years. "It's beautiful," Jack said, as they stood looking out over the snow-covered grounds. "But lonely. I bought it thinking I'd host dinner parties, maybe start a family here someday. Instead, it became another acquisition. Maybe that can change." There was something in his voice, not quite hope, but not resignation either, that made Fiona look at him more closely. In the soft afternoon light, she could see glimpses of the man he'd been before tragedy reshaped his life. The intelligence was still there, the kindness she'd observed on the street, but also a strength that homelessness hadn't managed to break. "Jack," she said, "I want you to know that this arrangement, it doesn't have to be purely transactional. I mean, I hope we can become friends." "Friends?" he repeated, as if testing the word. "I haven't had a friend in a long time. Neither have I. I have business associates, employees, acquaintances. But friends, real friends, require vulnerability, and I've never been good at that." "We'll figure it out," Jack said, echoing her words from Saturday as the afternoon shadows grew longer. Fiona felt something she hadn't experienced in years: contentment. Not the sharp satisfaction of closing a deal or the brief high of professional success, but a quiet, steady feeling of rightness. "I should let you settle in," she said finally, "but if you need anything or if you get lonely, the main house is always open. Thank you, Fiona, for all of this." As she walked back to the main house, Fiona caught herself smiling, a real smile, not the practiced expression she wore for business meetings. In her pocket, her phone buzzed with emails, stock alerts, and meeting reminders. But for the first time in months, she didn't immediately reach for it. Instead, she looked back at the guest house, where warm light glowed in the windows, and Jack Mallory was beginning the slow process of remembering how to live indoors. Tomorrow would bring challenges introducing him to her world, navigating the complex dynamics of their unusual partnership. But tonight, neither of them would be alone. The first week of cohabitation passed in a careful dance of mutual consideration. Fiona maintained her brutal work schedule, but found herself taking longer routes through the property that happened to pass by the guest house windows. Jack kept to himself mostly, reading in the garden when weather permitted, cooking simple meals in his kitchen, and taking long walks through the wooded areas of the estate. They met for coffee each morning at 8, a routine that had developed organically when Fiona discovered Jack was an early riser like herself. These conversations were polite, careful, each of them testing the boundaries of their new arrangement. Fiona learned that Jack had taught at Columbia for 12 years, that he'd specialized in American poetry of the 19th century, and that he'd published articles on Emily Dickinson that were still cited in academic journals. Jack learned that Fiona had built her company from the ground up after her parents' death, that she'd never taken a vacation longer than 3 days, and that she read voraciously but never fiction-only biographies, business texts, and historical accounts. It was on Thursday evening that their careful politeness began to crack. Fiona was working late in the main house library when she heard the sound of breaking glass from the direction of the guest house. She was out the door and across the garden before she'd fully processed what she'd heard, her heart racing with possibilities, intruders, accidents, medical emergencies. She found Jack standing in his kitchen, staring down at the remains of a coffee mug scattered across the tile floor. His hands were shaking, and when he looked up at her, his eyes held a wildness she hadn't seen before. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll replace it. I'll clean it up. Jack, it's just a mud. Are you hurt?" He shook his head, but continued staring at the broken pieces. I was making coffee, and suddenly I was back there in the apartment Elena and I shared. She had these mugs, blue ones with little flowers, and after the accident, I couldn't bear to look at them. I gave everything away, sold what I could, and walked out with nothing. His voice caught. I haven't made coffee in a real kitchen in 3 years. The sound of the mug hitting the floor, it brought it all back. Fiona moved carefully around the broken ceramic, not wanting to startle him. What happened to your family, Jack? You don't have to tell me, but sometimes talking helps. Jack sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his composure crumbling. Elena was a pediatrician. Sophie was 7, brilliant and funny and perfect in every way that matters. They were driving home from Sophie's piano lesson when a drunk driver ran. A red light. He paused, taking a shuddering breath. Elena died instantly. Sophie lived for 3 days in the ICU. I sat with her the whole time, reading her favorite stories, but she never woke up. Oh, Jack. Fiona felt tears prick her eyes. I'm so sorry. I fell apart completely. Stopped teaching, stopped writing, stopped caring about anything. The university was patient at first, gave me leave, offered counseling. But grief isn't something you recover from on a schedule. Eventually, they had to replace me. I lost the house, lost my savings to medical bills and legal fees. And one day, I just walked away from everything that reminded me of them. Fiona knelt down and began picking up the larger pieces of the broken mug, giving Jack a moment to compose himself. When she looked up, he was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. You don't have to clean up my messes, he said. I want to help. She continued gathering the fragments, placing them carefully in her palm. Jack, can I ask you something? He nodded. Double quotes. Do you think Elena and Sophie would want you to spend the rest of your life grieving? The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment Fiona worried she'd overstepped. But Jack considered it seriously, his eyes growing distant. Elena always said life was too precious to waste on regrets. She'd probably tell me to stop feeling sorry for myself and find a way to honor their memory by living fully. His voice grew stronger. Sophie, she'd want to know why I stopped reading stories to children. She loved it when I did voices for all the characters. Maybe someday you'll read to children again. Is that what this is about? Jack asked, looking at her directly. Your proposition. Are you trying to save me? Fiona paused in her cleanup, considering the question. Maybe. Or maybe I'm hoping you'll save me. From what? From becoming the kind of person who builds walls so high that no one can reach them. From dying alone in a house full of expensive things and empty rooms. She stood, holding the broken pieces. Maybe we're both trying to save each other. Jack looked at her for a long moment, then took the ceramic fragments from her hands and disposed of them in the trash. When he turned back to her, his eyes held something she hadn't seen before, not gratitude or wariness, but genuine warmth. Elena used to say that broken things could be mended stronger than they were before. He sighed quietly. Japanese pottery masters have a technique called kintsugi. They repair cracks with gold, making the repair part of the beauty rather than hiding it. You think we're both cracked pottery? I think we're both learning that our scars don't have to define us, but they can teach us how to be gentle with other people's wounds. Fiona felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Jack, I want you to know this arrangement. Between us, it doesn't have to stay purely business. I hope we can become friends, real friends. I'd like that, Jack said, and for the first time since she'd known him, his smile reached his eyes completely. I haven't had a real friend in a very long time. Neither have I. They stood in the small kitchen, surrounded by the debris of Jack's momentary breakdown and the beginning of something neither had planned for. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the estate in the kind of quiet that made honest conversations possible. "Tell me about Elena," Fiona said softly. "What was she like?" Jack's face softened with memory. "She was the kindest person I've ever known. She could find something to love in everyone she met. She worked with children who had cancer, and somehow, she never became cynical or bitter. Even when she lost patience, she'd grown to love." He paused, looking out the window at the falling snow. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said that strong people who learned to be gentle were the rarest kind. I'm not sure I qualify as gentle. You're here, cleaning up my mess, asking about my dead wife with genuine interest instead of jealousy or discomfort. That's gentleness, Fiona." The observation hit her more deeply than she expected. In her business world, showing interest in competitors' weaknesses was strategy. But this felt different, like genuine care for another person's pain. "I should let you finish settling in," she said finally, though she found herself reluctant to leave. "But Jack, if you need anything, if the nights get difficult, please don't hesitate to call. The main house can feel empty, but it doesn't have to be lonely." "Thank you," Jack said. "And Fiona? Thank you for not trying to fix me. Most people want to offer solutions when what you really need is just someone to witness the pain." As Fiona walked back to the main house through the gently falling snow, she realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful politeness was still there, but underneath it now was the beginning of genuine understanding. They were both people who had lost what mattered most to them, but perhaps together they could figure out how to build something new from the pieces that remained. The broken mug incident marked a turning point in their relationship. The careful politeness didn't disappear entirely, but it was tempered now with genuine concern and growing trust. Fiona found herself checking on Jack more frequently, not out of obligation, but because she'd begun to care about his well-being. Jack, in turn, started joining her for dinner in the main house several evenings a week, bringing books he thought she might enjoy and listening with genuine interest as she described the challenges of running a global corporation that it was during one of these dinners, 3 weeks after Jack had moved in, that Fiona's phone rang with the call that would change everything. "I'm sorry," she said, glancing at the screen. "It's my publicist. I should take this." Jack nodded, continuing to eat his meal while Fiona stepped into the next room. "Linda, what's so urgent that it couldn't wait until morning?" "Fiona, we have a problem. Someone photographed you with a man outside that Starbucks near your office building. The photos are all over social media, and the speculation is getting intense. Who is he?" Fiona's stomach dropped. She'd been so careful to keep Jack away from public spaces, but she'd forgotten about that first coffee meeting weeks ago. What kind of speculation? Everything from secret boyfriend to business partner to I'm quoting here, billionaire's midlife crisis. The story is gaining traction because you've been so private about your personal life. People are fascinated. Send me the photos," Fiona said, already knowing this was exactly the kind of attention she'd hoped to avoid. Already did. "Fiona, you need to get ahead of this. If you don't control the narrative, someone else will." Fiona ended the call and immediately opened her email. The photos were grainy but clear enough, and Jack at the Starbucks table, deep in conversation, his worn clothing and her expensive suit creating a stark visual contrast that any photographer would recognize as compelling. She returned to the dining room, where Jack was reading one of the books he'd brought, a collection of contemporary poetry she'd never heard of but found herself curious about. "Everything all right?" he asked, noticing her expression. "We've been photographed." She showed him the images on her phone. "Someone took these the day we first had coffee, and they're spreading on social media." Jack studied the photos with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. "I see the problem. You look like a successful businesswoman, and I look like someone who's been through hard times," Fiona finished. "Jack, I'm going to have to make some kind of public statement. The speculation is getting out of hand. What will you say? Fiona had been considering this question since Linda's call. The truth, mostly. That we're in a relationship, that it's serious, and that my personal life is exactly that personal. And when they dig deeper, because they will, then we deal with it when it happens. Fiona sat back down across from him. Jack, I need you to know that I don't care what people think about this arrangement, but I do care about how it affects you. If this becomes too much, are you asking me to leave? I'm asking if you want to leave. This level of scrutiny isn't something I can shield you from indefinitely. Jack was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of his book. 3 weeks ago, I was invisible. People looked through me on the street like I didn't exist. Now you're worried about me getting too much attention. It's different when the attention comes with judgment. I've been judged before. By people who thought I should get over my grief faster. By former colleagues who whispered about my fall from grace. By strangers who assumed I was an addict or mentally ill because I was homeless. Jack looked up at her. At least now the judgment comes with a warm bed and regular meals. The matter-of-fact way he said it made Fiona's chest tighten. You deserve better than that, maybe. But I'm not running away from this, Fiona. We made an agreement, and I intend to honor it. That night, Fiona lay awake thinking about honor and agreements, and the way Jack had looked when he talked about his wife and daughter. She'd built her life on contracts and negotiations, but somewhere along the way she'd forgotten that the most important agreements weren't written down in legal documents. They were made between people who chose to trust each other despite the risks. The next morning brought a fresh wave of media attention. Her assistant Sarah fielded calls from reporters, bloggers, and tabloid journalists, all wanting to know about the mysterious man in the coffee shop photos. Fiona's stock price actually rose slightly. Investors apparently found the idea of their CEO having a personal life reassuring rather than concerning. The board wants to meet with you, Sarah informed her during their morning briefing. They're not thrilled about the publicity. Schedule it for tomorrow, Fiona said. And Sarah? I want you to meet Jack properly. Would you like to join us for dinner tonight? Sarah's eyebrows rose. Really? Really? It's time to stop hiding. That evening, Fiona watched nervously as Sarah arrived at the main house, clearly curious and slightly apprehensive. Jack had dressed carefully for the occasion, khakis, a button-down shirt, and a sport coat that Fiona had quietly arranged to have tailored for him. He looked every inch the professor he'd once been. Sarah Chun, this is Jack Mallory, Fiona said, making introductions in the foyer. Jack, Sarah is the person who actually runs my company while I take credit for it. Sarah laughed, extending her hand to Jack. It's wonderful to finally meet you. Fiona has been remarkably secretive about you. Fiona values her privacy, Jack replied, shaking Sarah's hand with the kind of formal courtesy that spoke of good breeding. I imagine that makes your job more challenging when reporters come calling. You have no idea, Sarah said, warming to him immediately. But I have to admit, I'm fascinated by anyone who's managed to capture Fiona's attention. She's not exactly known for her social life. Sarah, Fiona warned, but she was smiling. Over dinner, Fiona watched Jack navigate Sarah's questions with skill and grace. He was vague about his recent past, but articulate about literature, education, and current events. Sarah, who had a master's degree in business and a sharp mind for reading people, seemed genuinely charmed by him. So what do you think of our workaholic CEO? Sarah asked Jack as they finished dessert. I think she's more complex than she lets people believe, Jack replied, glancing at Fiona. And I think she's forgotten how to rest. Finally, someone who gets it, Sarah said. I've been trying to convince her to take actual vacations for 8 years. As the evening wound down and Sarah prepared to leave, She pulled Fiona aside. "I like him," she said quietly. "He's not what I expected, but there's something genuine about him. Just be careful, okay? I know you think you can control everything, but people are complicated." After Sarah left, Fiona and Jack cleaned up the dishes together, working in comfortable silence. It felt domestic in a way that Fiona found both foreign and appealing. "Thank you," she said as they finished. "For tonight, for handling Sarah's questions, for not running when things got complicated. Thank you for including me." It felt good to have a normal conversation with someone new. As they said goodnight and Jack headed back to the guest house, Fiona realized that somewhere between the broken mug and tonight's dinner, their careful arrangement had begun to feel like something else entirely. She wasn't sure what to call it yet, but for the first time in years, she was looking forward to finding out. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, and Fiona arrived at her office an hour early to prepare. She'd faced hostile takeover attempts, congressional hearings, and billion-dollar lawsuits with less anxiety than she felt about explaining Jack to her board of directors. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd built an empire worth billions. But she felt like a teenager trying to justify her choice of boyfriend to disapproving parents. Sarah had arranged the conference room with her usual efficiency, complete with fresh coffee and the kind of pastries that would remain untouched while serious business was conducted. The board members filed in at precisely 10:08 men and 2 women, all wearing expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed disapproval. "Good morning," Fiona said, taking her seat at the head of the table. "I assume you've all seen the media coverage regarding my personal life." "We have," said Robert Chun, no relation to Sarah, the board's longest-serving member. "Fiona, we're concerned about the optics. The company's image has always been built on your reputation for focus and professionalism, and that hasn't changed," Fiona replied evenly. "My personal relationships have no bearing on my ability to run this company. But the speculation is affecting our stock price," added Margaret Williams, the board's lead financial officer. "And some of our largest investors are asking questions about your judgment." Fiona felt her temper beginning to rise, but kept her voice level. "My judgment has made this company profitable for 15 consecutive years. I think my track record speaks for itself." "Of course," Robert said quickly. "But the photos, this man appears to be homeless, or recently so." The implications, Fiona interrupted, "are that I'm dating someone, which last I checked was a normal human activity. Unless the board has decided to include relationship approval in my contract." The room fell silent. Fiona rarely displayed anger in board meetings, and when she did, it usually preceded major decisions that no one was prepared to question. It was then that her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Emergency. Need you in your office immediately." "Excuse me," Fiona said, standing. "We'll continue this discussion shortly." She found Sarah pacing in her office, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of panic. "Fiona, you need to sit down," Sarah said. "What's wrong?" "Dr. Morrison's office called. Your test results are back, and they need you to come in immediately. Today." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Fiona had almost forgotten about the routine blood work she'd had done 2 weeks ago, the quarterly screening that had become as automatic as checking her calendar. Did they say anything else? Just that Dr. Morrison wants to discuss the results in person and that it's urgent. Fiona closed her eyes, feeling the familiar cold dread that had haunted her since her first cancer diagnosis. She'd beaten it once, endured months of treatment, and emerged triumphant. But cancer, as Dr. Morrison had explained, was never truly gone. It was either dormant or active, sleeping or hunting. "Cancel the rest of the board meeting," she said quietly. "Tell them we'll reconvene tomorrow. Fiona, and call Jack. Ask him to meet me at Dr. Morrison's office." The words surprised her even as she said them. "Actually, no. I'll call him myself." Jack answered on the second ring, and Fiona found herself grateful for the calm steadiness of his voice. "I need you to come into the city," she said without preamble. "My doctor wants to see me about some test results, and I don't want to." "Go alone." There was a pause. "Of course. Where should I meet you?" She gave him the address and hung up, then sat in her office chair staring out at the Manhattan skyline. 3 months ago, her biggest concerns had been quarterly earnings and market share. Now she was about to learn whether her carefully constructed new life was about to be cut short. Dr. Morrison's office was in one of those sleek medical buildings on the Upper East Side, all glass and steel, and the kind of expensive minimalism that was supposed to inspire confidence. Fiona arrived first and sat in the waiting room, trying to read her phone but finding the words swimming before her eyes. When Jack walked in, still slightly out of breath from rushing, Fiona felt something in her chest ease. He dressed carefully. Pants, a white shirt, a tie, and she realized he understood the gravity of the situation without her having to explain it. "Thank you for coming," she said as he sat beside her. "Thank you for calling me." They didn't speak much while they waited, but Jack's presence beside her was steadying in a way she hadn't expected. When Dr. Morrison finally called her name, Fiona stood on unsteady legs. "Do you want me to come with you?" Jack asked quietly. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Dr. Morrison was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and the sort of gentle authority that came from delivering both good news and devastating diagnoses for 30 years. She gestured for them to sit across from her desk, and Fiona noticed that she'd arranged her materials carefully. The test results, Fiona's file, a box of tissues placed strategically within reach. "Fiona, I'm going to be direct with you because I know that's how you prefer to receive information. Your tumor markers are elevated significantly from your last test. We need to run additional scans immediately, but I'm concerned that the cancer has returned." The words hit Fiona like a physical blow. She'd prepared herself for this possibility, planned for it, but hearing it spoken aloud made it terrifyingly real. "How significantly elevated?" she asked, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "Enough that we need to act quickly. I've scheduled you for a full-body scan tomorrow morning, and depending on those results, we'll determine the best course of treatment." Fiona nodded, her mind already racing through the implications. Treatment schedules, business continuity plans, the adoption process that would now be complicated or impossible. "Dr. Morrison," Jack said quietly, "what's the timeline we're looking at?" "That depends entirely on what the scans show. If it's a recurrence in the same location, we caught it early and treatment options are good. If it's metastasized," she paused delicately, "then we're looking at managing the disease rather than curing it." Fiona felt the room spinning slightly and gripped the arms of her chair. Beside her, Jack reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm and steady against her cold skin. "What do we do now?" Fiona asked. "Now we wait for tomorrow's results and take things one step at a time." "Fiona, I know this is frightening, but we've been here before. You're strong, you're otherwise healthy, and we have many more treatment options available than we did 3 years ago." As they left the doctor's office, Fiona felt like she was moving through thick fog. The city sound seemed muffled, the people rushing past them blurred at the edges. Jack hailed a taxi and gave the driver her home address, then sat quietly beside her as Manhattan flowed past the windows. "I'm scared," she said finally, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside her. "I know," Jack replied, "but you're not facing this alone." It wasn't until they were back at the estate, sitting in the main house living room with untouched cups of tea growing cold between them, that Fiona fully processed what the diagnosis might mean. "If the cancer has spread," she said, "everything changes. The adoption plans, our arrangement, your future." "Fiona," Jack interrupted gently, Let's wait for the test results before we start planning for the worst. But what if? Then we'll figure it out together. That's what partners do. The word partners hung in the air between them, and Fiona realized that somewhere between the broken mug and tonight's phone call, their business arrangement had become something neither of them had planned for. As the evening shadows lengthened across the living room, Fiona found herself thinking not about stock prices or board meetings or even treatment protocols, but about the quiet strength of the man sitting beside her, ready to face an uncertain future together. The scan results arrived on a Thursday afternoon, wrapped in the clinical language that doctors use to deliver life-altering news. Dr. Morrison called personally, a voice carefully neutral, as she explained that while the cancer had returned, it appeared to be localized and caught early. Treatment would be aggressive, but manageable surgery, followed by chemotherapy, a protocol Fiona remembered all too well from her first battle. The good news, Dr. Morrison said, is that this time we know exactly what we're dealing with. The challenging news is that we need to move quickly. I'd like to schedule surgery for next week. Fiona sat in her office, phone pressed to her ear, watching the city bustle below while her world shifted on its axis once again. What's the prognosis? With early intervention, very good. But Fiona, you'll need support during treatment. This isn't something you can manage alone while running a company. After hanging up, Fiona stared at her reflection in the dark computer screen. She'd built her life on the illusion of control, but cancer had a way of stripping away such comforting delusions. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd brought Jack into her life to help create a legacy, but now he might be the one helping her fight for enough time to see it realized. That evening, she found Jack in the guest house kitchen, preparing what had become their ritual dinner together. He looked up as she entered, and she saw that he already knew from her expression. The scan results came back, she said without preamble. The cancer has returned, but it's localized. Surgery next week, followed by chemotherapy. Jack sat down, the wooden spoon he'd been using, and turned to face her fully. What can I do? The simplicity of the question, asked without drama or lengthy processing, nearly undid her. I don't know. I've never been sick with someone else depending on me. I'm not depending on you, Fiona. We're depending on each other. There's a difference. She sat heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, suddenly exhausted. The board is going to panic. The investors will want reassurance about succession planning. The media god, if they find out about this on top of everything else, one thing at a time. Jack said, returning to his cooking with the same methodical calm she'd come to associate with him. What's most important right now? Surgery. Getting through treatment. Making sure the company doesn't fall apart while I'm recovering. Then that's what we focus on. Over dinner, they talked through the practical implications. Fiona would need to take medical leave, something she'd never done in 15 years of running the company. Sarah would coordinate with the executive team to manage day-to-day operations. Jack would, what will you do? Fiona asked, realizing she hadn't considered his role in all this. Whatever you need me to do. Drive you to appointments, manage the house, deal with reporters if they show up here. Fight insurance companies if necessary. You do that? Jack looked at her as if the question surprised him. Fiona, we may have started this as a business arrangement, but that's not what it is anymore. At least not for me. The admission hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. Fiona felt her chest tighten, but not with the familiar anxiety of her diagnosis, with something warmer and more complex. I need to tell Sarah, she said finally, and probably the board, though I'd prefer to wait until after surgery to see how things look. What about your family? Do you have siblings, relatives who should know? No family left. My parents died in that plane crash, and I was an only child. There are some distant cousins I haven't spoken to in years. The loneliness of it struck. or more forcefully than usual. "You're it, Jack. You're my emergency contact." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of that responsibility. "Then I'll make sure I'm worthy of it." The next few days passed in a blur of medical appointments, treatment planning, and careful management of information. Fiona told Sarah about the diagnosis, swearing her to secrecy until the surgery was complete. Sarah took the news with her. Characteristic efficiency, immediately beginning to coordinate coverage for Fiona's responsibilities and researching the best oncology care available. "The executive team can handle operations," Sarah assured her during one of their planning sessions. "But you'll need to make some decisions about public disclosure. If you're going to be out for an extended period, let's wait and see how the surgery goes," Fiona said. "I don't want to create panic unnecessarily." What she didn't say was that she was terrified of appearing vulnerable to her competitors, her investors, or the media that had recently discovered her personal life. CEOs weren't supposed to get sick, weren't supposed to need time to recover, weren't supposed to be human in ways that affected stock prices. Jack seemed to understand her fears without her having to voice them. He took over the practical aspects of her life with quiet competence, managing the household staff, screening phone calls, and somehow creating the kind of calm domestic environment that Fiona had never experienced. He cooked meals that she could stomach despite her anxiety, read to her in the evenings when she was too stressed to focus on business documents, and asked no questions about their future together that she wasn't ready to answer. 3 days before the surgery, they sat in the main house living room as rain drummed against the windows. Fiona had been trying to read quarterly reports, but the numbers kept blurring together. "I've been thinking," Jack said, looking up from his book, "about our arrangement." Fiona's stomach clenched. "If you want to leave, I want to marry you." The words were so unexpected that Fiona was certain she'd misheard. "What?" "I want to marry you. Before the surgery. Not because of some contract or business arrangement, but because I care about you and I want to be able to make medical decisions if necessary. I want to be the person who sits in the waiting room and demands answers from doctors. I want to be your husband, not just your houseguest." Fiona stared at him, her mind racing. "Jack, you don't have to. This isn't about obligation. These past few weeks, living here with you, getting to know who you really are beneath all that armor you wear, I've fallen in love with you, Fiona. And I think maybe you might feel the same way about me." The admission hung in the air between them like a challenge. Fiona had spent so many years building walls around her heart that she'd forgotten what it felt like to want to tear them down for someone else. "I do," she said quietly. "Feel the same way, I mean. But Jack, if the surgery doesn't go well, if the treatment doesn't work, you'd be signing up for something that could end badly." "I already lost the love of my life once," Jack said, his voice steady but gentle. "I know exactly what I'm risking. But I also know that loving someone, even with the possibility of losing them, is better than the alternative." Fiona felt tears she'd been holding back for days finally spill over. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." The next morning, Fiona made 2 phone calls. The first was to the county clerk's office to arrange a marriage license. The second was to a small chapel in the village, asking if they could perform a simple ceremony that afternoon. As she hung up the phone, Fiona realized that in 3 months, Jack Mallory had done something she'd thought impossible. He taught her that the best business deals were sometimes the ones written in the heart rather than on paper. Tomorrow she would face surgery and an uncertain future, but she wouldn't face it alone. And for the first time since her diagnosis, that felt like enough. The chapel was small and simple, with wooden pews that had been worn smooth by decades of weddings, christenings, and funeral services. Afternoon sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the floor where Fiona and Jack stood facing each other. Sarah served as their witness, having closed the office early with the excuse of a family emergency, which, Fiona reflected, wasn't entirely untrue. Fiona had chosen a simple navy dress, elegant but not formal, something that wouldn't look out of place in a business meeting or a hospital waiting room. Jack wore the same suit he'd worn to dinner with Sarah, but he'd added a tie that brought out the green in his eyes. They looked like what they were, two people who had found each other later in life when they both stopped believing in fairy tales. Reverend Patricia Woolsey was a woman in her 60s who had presided over the spiritual lives of their small Westchester community for 20 years. She'd agreed to perform the ceremony on short notice, asking only that they speak honestly about their intentions. "Marriage," she began, her voice carrying the weight of experience, "is not just a legal contract or a social convention. It's a promise to stand witness to each other's lives, to share both the burden and the joy of being human. Fiona and Jack, you've chosen to make this commitment not at the beginning of your adult lives, but at a moment when you both understand what loss means, what resilience requires, and what love costs." Fiona felt Jack's hand warm in hers, steadying her as the Reverend continued. "The vows you're about to exchange aren't the promises of young people who believe love conquers all. They're the promises of adults who know that love is what you choose to do when life becomes difficult." They had written their own vows, sitting together the night before with legal pads and a kind of careful honesty that had become the foundation of their relationship. "Jack," Fiona began, her voice stronger than she'd expected. 3 months ago, you were a stranger on a street corner, and I was a woman who had confused success with happiness. You've taught me that the most valuable things in life can't be purchased, negotiated, or controlled. You've shown me what it means to be truly seen by another person. I promise to stand by you not because of any contract we've signed, but because choosing to love you has been the best decision I've ever made. I promise to trust you with my fears, my hopes, and my heart. I promise to build a life with you based on truth, kindness, and the belief that we're stronger together than apart." Jack's eyes never left her face as she spoke, and when it was his turn, his voice carried the same quiet conviction that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "Fiona, you offered me a chance to matter again when I'd forgotten that I could. You saw something in me that I'd lost sight of, and you gave me the courage to become that person again. You've shown me that it's possible to love someone new without betraying the memory of those we've lost. I promise to be your partner in whatever comes, health or illness, success or failure, ordinary days and extraordinary challenges. I promise to help you remember that you are more than your achievements, that your worth isn't measured by stock prices or board meetings. I promise to love you for who you are, not who you think you need to be." The Reverend asked for the rings, and Sarah stepped forward with the simple bands they'd chosen that morning, white gold, unadorned, substantial enough to withstand whatever lay ahead. As Jack slipped the ring onto Fiona's finger, she realized that her hands had stopped shaking for the first time in days. "By the power vested in me by the state of New York," Reverend Woolsey said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jack, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, almost tentative, the first real kiss they'd shared, sweet with the promise of intimacy to come and the acknowledgement of everything they'd overcome to reach this moment. After the ceremony, they drove back to the estate in comfortable silence, wedding rings catching the late afternoon light. Sarah had insisted on stopping at the village bakery to pick up a small cake, nothing elaborate, just vanilla sponge with buttercream frosting. But it felt important to mark the occasion with something traditional. The main house felt different as they entered it together as husband and wife. The grand foyer that had always seemed too large for one person now felt like the entrance to a real home. Jack carried the cake to the kitchen while Fiona poured 2 glasses of sparkling water from the refrigerator. She'd stopped drinking alcohol during her first cancer treatment and never resumed the habit. To unexpected partnerships, Jack said, raising his glass. To second chances, Fiona replied, touching her glass to his. They sat at the kitchen island, sharing cake from the same plate, and Fiona marveled at how natural it felt. No cameras, no guests, no elaborate celebration. Just two people who had chosen each other in full knowledge of what that choice might cost. I should call Dr. Morrison, Fiona said eventually. Update my emergency contact information. I should. Call the hospital's financial office, Jack added. Make sure I can access information about your care. The practical details of marriage felt surprisingly intimate. The legal right to make decisions for each other, to be present during vulnerable moments, to speak for one another when speaking became impossible. Fiona had built her career on maintaining control, but there was something deeply peaceful about sharing that burden with someone she trusted completely. As evening approached, they moved to the living room, where Jack built a fire in the fireplace that Fiona had never used. The room filled with warm light and the scent of burning oak, transforming the formal space into something cozy and welcoming. Are you nervous about tomorrow? Jack asked as they settled on the sofa together. Terrified, Fiona admitted. Not just about the surgery, but about what comes after. If the treatment is as difficult as it was before, we'll manage it together, one day at a time, one challenge at a time. Fiona curled against Jack's side, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. I keep thinking about what you said about losing Elena and Sophie. How do you find the courage to love someone again when you know how much it can hurt? Jack was quiet for a moment, his hand stroking her hair. After they died, I thought the pain meant I'd loved them well. I thought suffering was how I honored their memory. It took me 3 years to realize that Elena would have been furious with me for wasting my life on grief. But weren't you afraid to let yourself care about someone new? Every day. But I was also afraid of staying numb forever. And then I met you, and you were so obviously strong and so obviously lonely, and I realized that maybe we could help each other remember how to be human again. They talked until late into the night, sharing stories they'd never told anyone else, Jack's memories of teaching and the joy he'd found in opening young minds to literature, Fiona's early struggles to build her company, and the loneliness of success without someone to share it with. They talked about their fears for the future and their hopes for what they might build together. As they prepared for bed, Fiona in the main house, Jack still in the guest house, but now connected by marriage rather than separated by arrangement. Fiona felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the absolute certainty that whatever tomorrow brought, she wouldn't face it alone. Jack, she called softly as he prepared to walk back to the guest house. Yes, thank you for seeing something in me worth saving. Thank you for seeing something in me worth finding. After he left, Fiona sat at her bedroom window looking out at the guest house, where light glowed warmly in the windows. Tomorrow would bring surgery and an uncertain future. But tonight she was a woman who had found love in the most unexpected place, with a man who understood that the deepest commitments were made not in moments of joy, but in moments of fear, when choosing to trust each other was an act of courage. She touched her wedding ring, still unfamiliar on her finger, and smiled. In all her years of business deals and negotiations, she'd never made an agreement that felt as solid as the promises she and Jack had exchanged that afternoon. Some contracts, she realized, were written not in legal language, but in the quiet moments when two people decided to face an uncertain future together. 18 months later, Fiona stood in the doorway of what had once been her formal dining room, watching Jack help 8-year-old Emma Martinez, soon to be Emma Mallory, with her homework. The room had been transformed from a showcase of expensive furniture into a warm family space, complete with a smaller table perfect for after-school snacks and art projects that somehow always involved more glitter than any reasonable person should allow in their home. The answer is 7, Jack was saying patiently, pointing to Emma's math worksheet. But can you tell me how you got there? Emma, a serious child with dark curls and intelligent eyes that reminded Fiona of herself at that age, chewed thoughtfully on her pencil eraser. I counted the apples in the first basket, then the apples in the second basket, then I added them together. Perfect. That's exactly right. Fiona smiled, remembering the first time they'd met Emma at the adoption agency. 6 months ago. The little girl had been in foster care for 2 years after her grandmother, her last living relative, had passed away. During their initial meeting, Emma had been polite but guarded, clearly accustomed to disappointment from adults who made promises they couldn't keep. It had been Jack who'd broken through her reserve, not with grand gestures or expensive gifts, but by simply sitting on the floor of the agency's playroom and reading to her from a book of fairy tales. Emma had listened with the focused attention of a child who understood that stories were sometimes the only reliable magic in the world. The adoption process had been lengthy and thorough background checks, home visits, interviews, and mountains of paperwork that even Fiona's legal team had found daunting. But throughout it all, Emma had grown more comfortable with them, spending weekends at the estate, gradually claiming space in their lives and their hearts. Fiona, Emma called, noticing her in the doorway. Come see my math. I got all the addition problems right. Fiona moved into the room, her steps still slightly careful, a lingering caution from the months of treatment that had finally ended with clean scans and Dr. Morrison's cautious but optimistic prognosis. The surgery had been successful, the chemotherapy brutal but effective, and the recovery longer than her impatient nature had preferred. But Jack had been there for every appointment, every difficult day, every small victory, proving that love was indeed what you chose to do when life became challenging. That's wonderful, sweetheart, Fiona said, examining Emma's worksheet. You're getting so good at math. Pretty soon you'll be helping me with the company's quarterly reports. Emma giggled. I don't think I'm ready for that yet. Give it a few years, Jack said, winking at Fiona. Your mom is very persuasive when she wants something. The word mom still sent a warm shock through Fiona's chest. She'd never imagined that hearing herself called by that simple title would feel more significant than being named CEO of the Year by Forbes magazine. But Emma's casual use of it had become one of her greatest treasures. The adoption had been finalized 3 weeks ago in a courthouse ceremony that was simultaneously mundane and miraculous. Judge Catherine Riley had signed the papers with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to all family court proceedings. But for Fiona, Jack, and Emma, it had been the moment when their chosen family became legally real. Can we work on my story now? Emma asked, having finished her math. The one about the princess who builds her own castle? Of course, Jack said, clearing away the worksheets. But first, let's clean up these pencils. As Emma carefully organized her school supplies, a habit she'd developed from years of moving between temporary homes, Fiona marveled at the transformation of their lives. The guest house had been converted into Jack's home office, where he worked on the book he was writing about resilience and second chances. He'd also returned to teaching, part-time at a local community college, rediscovering his passion for literature and young minds eager to learn. Fiona had restructured her role at the company, promoting Sarah to Chief Operating Officer and learning to delegate responsibilities she'd once hoarded. She still worked long hours, but she also made time for school plays, homework help, and family dinners that had become sacred rituals in their household. Okay, Jack said as Emma settled back into her chair with a notebook and her favorite purple pen. Where did we leave off with Princess Sophia? She just finished building the tower where she keeps all her books, Emma said, consulting previous pages of her story. And now she needs to build the part where she helps other people. Fiona sat down across from them, pretending to review emails on her phone but actually listening to Emma's story unfold. The princess in Emma's tale was brave and kind, but also practical. She built her castle with secret passages for escape routes and included a workshop where she could invent things to help her kingdom prosper. "She sounds like a very wise princess," Jack observed as Emma wrote. "Building something beautiful, but also making sure she can take care of her people." "She learned from her mistakes," Emma said seriously. "In the beginning, she tried to do everything by herself, but then she realized that the best castles are built with help from friends." The comment was so perfectly 8-year-old profound that Fiona felt tears prick her eyes. Emma had experienced more loss and uncertainty in her short life than most adults, but she'd somehow retained an essential optimism about the possibility of happiness. As the afternoon light began to fade, they moved to the kitchen to prepare dinner together, another ritual that Fiona treasured. Emma stood on a step stool, carefully washing vegetables while Jack managed the stovetop and Fiona set the table. The kitchen filled with the scent of garlic and herbs, and with the easy conversation of a family that had learned to appreciate ordinary moments. "Tell me about your day," Fiona said to Emma as they sat down to eat. "What was the best part?" Emma considered the question seriously, as she did most things. "Reading time. Mrs. Patterson let me read to the kindergarten class, and they all listened." "Really well. You're a natural teacher," Jack said. "Just like your dad." The casual way he claimed the title still made Fiona's heart swell. Jack had embraced fatherhood with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else, reading bedtime stories, helping with school projects, and providing the kind of steady, patient presence that Emma had never experienced before. After dinner, they settled in the living room for their evening routine. Emma curled up on the sofa between them while Jack read from The Secret Garden. They were halfway through, savoring the story one chapter at a time. Fiona listened to his voice, bringing the characters to life, watching Emma's face reflect every emotion of the plot. When it was time for bed, they walked Emma upstairs to her room painted pale yellow with white furniture and shelves full of books that Jack had carefully selected for her expanding reading level. As Fiona tucked her in, Emma looked up with the serious expression she wore when asking important questions. "Fiona, do you think we'll always be a family?" The question came from a place of hard-earned wariness, and Fiona answered with all the certainty she could muster. "Always, sweetheart. No matter what happens, you're our daughter and we're your parents. That doesn't change, even if you get sick again." Fiona felt Jack's presence behind her, solid and reassuring. "Even then, we're in this together, all three of us." Emma nodded, satisfied, and closed her eyes as Fiona kissed her forehead. Later, as she and Jack cleaned up the kitchen together, Fiona reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years ago, she'd been a woman convinced that success meant control, that vulnerability was weakness, that love was a luxury she couldn't afford. Now she was a wife, a mother, a cancer survivor, and somehow happier than she'd ever been. "What are you thinking about?" Jack asked, noticing her contemplative mood. "Legacy," Fiona said, drying the last plate. "I used to think it meant buildings with my name on them, or company stock that would outlive me. But watching Emma write her stories, seeing her learn to trust that we'll be here tomorrow, that feels like the only legacy that really matters." Jack smiled, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Princess Sophia would approve. Princess Sophia is wise beyond her years." As they turned off the lights and headed upstairs, Fiona caught sight of their reflection in the darkened window too. People who had found each other when they both stopped believing in happy endings, now building something neither had dared to hope for. On her nightstand sat a framed photo from Emma's adoption day, the three of them standing on the courthouse steps, Emma between them with a smile that could power the entire city. It was the first family portrait Fiona had ever been part of, and looking at it reminded her that the most important business deals were sometimes the ones written in love rather than contracts. Outside, snow began to fall again, blanketing the pie. A state in the kind of peaceful quiet that only came with winter evenings and the knowledge that everyone you loved was safe under the same roof. Fiona fell asleep thinking about tomorrow's plans. Emma's school conference, Jack's evening class, her own manageable schedule of meetings that would end in time for dinner together. It was. She realized an utterly ordinary life made extraordinary by the simple miracle of being shared with the right people. Sometimes the greatest success was simply learning how to be happy. And happiness, it turned out, was much simpler than she'd ever imagined. It was homework help and bedtime stories, morning coffee and evening conversations. The daily choice to show up for each other, regardless of what challenges the day might bring. In the end, that was the only legacy that truly mattered, not what you built, but whom you loved and how well you loved them in return.